today about trans-Tasman migration in terms of very closely knit, let's say, linkage to Australia, and there's some very distinctive things about it that I think sort of make it quite special. And it is a special relationship. So we'll talk about immigration from Australia to New Zealand, but I'm mainly talking about New Zealanders in Australia and some of the special visa regulations that allow that movement. I'm also going to talk a little bit just about the Pacific Islanders, because the best way into Australia is for the Pacific Islanders is to go to New Zealand, get into New Zealand, get New Zealand citizenship, and then come to Australia. So it's like backdoor migration that I'll point out to you, which is quite important. South Africans can also do that. Some South African migrants go to New Zealand, get their New Zealand citizenship, then they find it easier to meet some of the requirements for Australia. So this movement of New Zealand citizens to and from Australia depends on the economic conditions in both countries. So in good times, good economic times in Australia, we see increases in New Zealanders. If there's sort of relatively good times in New Zealand, we don't see as many. And if the economy goes down a bit in Australia, you see them actually go home. So when those economic conditions slow down a bit in Australia, we often see a spike in immigration of New Zealanders back home. Just depends on, there's two types of New Zealanders, which you'll know who they are, I think, when I get to the end of the lecture, okay? So the 10 largest overseas born groups. 2011 means it's my last census I actually have. So I'm looking at, what am I looking at? Data from the census is telling me how many New Zealanders in Australia. It's a stock of migrants. And I put a little question in your exam when I said it last night, and given that you're here and you're listening, even if you're listening online, yes, I've actually asked a question about the stock and flows and how you distinguish them and how you measure them and what a limitation of the data is. Because I keep reinforcing, and you really need to know what we're talking about. So when I say there's 483,397 enumerated in 2011, New Zealand born, you know that's okay, stock of migrants. Now note, I said New Zealand born, overseas born. They might actually be born somewhere else, which we'll get to at the end of the lecture as well, but they've come in under New Zealand citizenship, which there's this difference. So New Zealand born New Zealanders, obviously the numbers are quite high. In 2006, it was up from 394,000 in 2001, an increase of 20%. It's second to UK born in both 2006 and 2011, making up 9.6% of the overseas born, almost 10% of the overseas born population in Australia. Back in 1954, there was 43,000 New Zealand born, I should say, and clearly that's increased very dramatically up to recent years. If we look at this diagram again, I have shown you this, and this is permanent residents coming in, and you find the red here coming through this graph is New Zealand and Pacific Islanders. As I said, those Pacific Island country borns often are coming through as New Zealand citizens into Australia, but they've been born elsewhere. So they're becoming gradually a larger part of immigration overall. This blue, the pale blue, is Asia, and clearly Asia is far outstripping these other countries in recent additions. So if we look at arrivals and departures, 2012-13, this was the latest data I could get actually. In one financial year, 2011-12, 60,000 New Zealand citizens came to Australia as permanent and long-term arrivals. Your long-term arrivals, remember, are over 12 months, going to stay for a period longer than 12 months, and those who have said they're permanent. So it's an increase of 20%, 2% on the previous year. So it's very, very big rise that year. In 2012-13, 52,000 New Zealand citizens arrived, a decrease of roughly 13% on that previous year. Of those, 41,000 arrived as permanent settlers and 10,000 odd were long-term arrivals. So long-term arrivals can be students and other people just being considered as staying in Australia as a year as a temporary mover. Permanent departures of New Zealand citizens increased in 2012-13 to 10,000, up 19% from 2011-12. Whenever we get a surge in the numbers, we tend to get a bigger departure 1 or 2 years after that time. That happens in all the stats, but in particular to New Zealanders. Intended state of residence, in other words, where did they intend to live? Those, I'm talking about the permanent and the long-term. New Zealand citizens, I keep saying citizens, remember, not New Zealand born, because citizens mean it can be other nations within that citizenship group. 20% stated they intend to live in New South Wales. Let's say a third said they were going to live in Queensland. 23% Victoria and say 25th in Western Australia. So again, bulk of them are saying they're going to Queensland. Along the Sunshine Coast and Gold Coast, you'll find a lot of New Zealanders. A lot of them are coming as they've got apartments, or they come for the winter, or they're away from New Zealand, they come to Australia in those periods. New Zealanders coming to Australia are mostly New Zealand born, were mostly male and mostly young, 2/3 of them less than 30 years of age. Of the short-term arrivals, that's under that year, saw an increase of citizens to number over 1 million. So it's quite a lot of traffic, if you like, between New Zealand and Australia, not just permanent, long-term, but obviously short-term arrivals, making up over 1 million. And most of them going to the Gold Coast or the Sunshine State of Queensland. Of those New Zealanders, permanent long-term, coming to Australia, who said they were employed and had an occupation, 59% were skilled. Again, this skilled movement. 20% were semi-skilled and 20% were unskilled. So those occupations, I'll tell you in a minute why it's also important for them to get permanent residency. But coming in, they don't have to meet a points test, or they don't have to meet some of the skilled categories that are very strict on the open migration program.
Could you come to New Zealand as an unskilled?
Sorry?
Could you come to New Zealand as an unskilled? So, like Pacific Islands, unskilled could go to New Zealand, and
yes.
unskilled to Australia.
Yes, because if they only have to wait 2 years in New Zealand and get New Zealand citizenship. And because a lot of Pacific Islanders are more likely to be unskilled or low skilled, they move on to New Zealand. They move to New Zealand, they got, well, let's say, looser rules or more lax conditions. So then this has been the problem with non-visa migration to Australia. As long as you became a New Zealand citizen, you were entitled to bilateral agreement and being able to come to Australia. And Australians, low skilled, can go to New Zealand as well, or unskilled. So there's a two-way exchange there, reciprocal arrangements. What was interesting there, the bulk of them are skilled. They're coming for jobs and they're getting work. Remember the day I talked about NOM, net overseas migration, arrivals and departure of New Zealand citizens. And again, if we look just over that decade, 30,000 went up to 52,000 in 2007-8. It rose again in 2011-12. Wherever you find quite big arrivals, you'll find higher departures, which have been happening in recent years. And this net figure here is still showing you 36,000, 30,000, etc. So those non-arrivals and departures are fairly well balanced and on a yearly basis, adding to that stock. We're talking about the stock of migrants from the census. Okay, there's special conditions for New Zealanders. They're not counted as part of Australia's annual migration program, so they don't come in those caps, where we have capped skill, capped economic, capped family. They don't come, they're outside of those caps, but are included in settler arrival and the overseas migration figures. So we still get them in those settler employment figures, and we still get them in our net overseas migration arrivals. That's when they're arriving or leaving more than a 12-month period, so that anything under that, those medium were classified as short-term. And it's basically non-visaed migration. So unlike for everyone else that you have to apply for visas, there is a special visa, but you get that on arrival through your passport anyway, so you don't apply for it before you actually come. I showed you this table the other day. These are just the New Zealand citizens, and clearly every year we're getting quite this is in thousand. The amount fluctuates a bit, but clearly they're adding to our overall net overseas migration figures. So this trans-Tasman movement, why is it called trans-Tasman? Tasman Sea, yeah. So if you see just trans-Tasman movement, that's what's going on. New Zealanders continue to have this privileged entry outside of that program, so they're outside of those caps, and they're outside of some of the conditions that apply. And they apply, as you know by now, to all other immigrants, despite some restrictions now being applied to New Zealanders since 2001, and I'll say why in a minute. Australian citizens have similar rights of entry to New Zealand as part of the Trans-Tasman Agreement in 1973. So if we're Australian citizens, we have got similar rights to go backwards and forwards. Again, I keep saying citizens. Why do I keep saying citizens?
Because they could be permanent residents in New Zealand without the citizenship?
Mainly because I'm saying citizens. So if I'm saying Australian born, it would be just Australian born, but Australian citizens can include you from Sweden who's just become an Australian citizen, or the Spanish lady here who's just become an Australian citizen, so they have these equal rights if they're citizens. Australian born, you might have Australian born and a citizen, well, you're automatically a citizen, but if you're another country born or overseas born outside of Australia, and you're not an Australian citizen, you're going to have to apply a visa for New Zealand, just like in reverse we're talking about. So passport entry of Australian a New Zealand citizen. So all you need is your passport, not a visa. So this travel agreement, decided in 1973, has allowed both Australian and New Zealand citizens, I keep saying citizens, to enter each other's country to visit, live, work without the need to apply for a visa. So you don't need to apply for a work visa. You can come if you've got a job, and you can actually, don't have to even go through an employer-nominated scheme. You can come into Australia and apply for a job, or apply for a job in Australia from New Zealand. You get a special category visa, however, which was introduced in 1994. When you actually come show your passport, you automatically, you have to have a New Zealand passport. You automatically actually get that visa. It could be temporary until such time you become permanent in Australia. But clearly that special visa works to let you in and work and whatever. So when you present the passport, they're considered to have applied for the visa and automatically receive this special category visa, which is recorded electronically and stamped on your passport. Why did we change some of the bilateral social security arrangement between Australia and New Zealand? Because there was a fear that New Zealanders were coming into Australia and collecting relatively generous unemployment and other benefits, simply moved over and were collecting benefits, but you really didn't have much chance of work or weren't working. So those who arrived after June 2001, they must apply and be granted Australian permanent residence to access certain social security payments not covered by the bilateral agreement, obtain Australian citizen, or sponsor their family members for permanent residence. So in other words, they had to get permanent residency after 2001 to be able to claim benefits. So unemployment benefits, child support benefits were denied to those with without permanent resident status. So there was a catch here. No longer you could just come and be able to collect benefits. You had to actually go the next step and get permanent resident status, which, as we talked about, is a bit difficult. You've actually got to meet criteria or be sponsored or go through an independent points assessment test. Why? Well, basically changes in regulations. And there's been several introduced since the 80s to limit New Zealand's access to services in Australia, and that's been the prime reason. So 2001, New Zealand citizens were required to obtain permanent Australian residence to assess their social security, to obtain Australian citizenship. So you couldn't get citizenship until you got permanent resident status, and you also couldn't sponsor any family members to come to be permanent residents in Australia with you until you got your permanent resident status. Because those family members might not have had New Zealand citizenship, for example, so we would have to be sponsored into Australia. Or they might be refugees or other groups that have to be sponsored, and you couldn't do it. However, there was no limit on the number of New Zealanders coming to Australia or ability to work. So that wasn't restricted. The numbers weren't restricted, it was just what they had access to was restricted, and that causes a bit of a problem when we get through to the end. Reasons leading to those restrictions between 1999 or late 90s and 2000 saw a sharp increase in the share of New Zealand citizens who were trans-Tasman migrants who had been born in other countries, especially the Pacific Islanders, people from Asian countries as well as refugees accepted by New Zealand from Africa and the Middle East. So, in other words, these people from other countries were being accepted as refugees and others in those countries once they actually obtained their New Zealand status, citizen status, they were actually free to come to Australia. It's referred to as the backdoor entry of migrants who might not have qualified for residence in Australia under our immigration program and the visa requirements of that program. So this, rather than anything else, caused Australian government concern rather than the volume of migrants coming to Australia. They were more worried about the backdoor migrants, that many of these groups wouldn't have qualified normally to be able to come into Australia. And so therefore, that's why they've put some restrictions on that. And this growth that we're talking about up to that 2001 period where they put those restrictions, you can see how really it took off. This is 73 was basically when we had this agreement, and then up thereafter you can see the growth in numbers. And this is just New Zealand born, not New Zealand citizens, but this is just the growth in the New Zealand born. Australians who moved to New Zealand remained entitled to all the benefits that New Zealand citizens enjoyed, and were not required to apply for residence in order to access benefits, as was the case for New Zealanders coming to Australia after June 2001. So the consequence of these restrictions, according to Birrell and Rapson, they argued was to reduce the numbers of New Zealand citizens receiving social security. Rather than the number of them, it was just to reduce those who were more welfare dependent. And I think this is the main reason, to prevent immigrants from third countries gaining backdoor entry through New Zealand, because entry to New Zealand was easier than to Australia. And they also changed in 2000, this is their let's say, interest in skilled migration more and more, to bring the whole immigration system more under the control of Australia's new immigration policy, which, remember, is emphasising skilled. So it wasn't really keen at just accepting a lot of lower skilled, semi-skilled workers, particularly from a lot of Pacific Island countries at that time. They also argued that, in effect, they were granted permanent residence, this is New Zealanders, citizens, permanent residence without having to meet standards required of citizens of other nations. Okay, so it really closed down that loophole, which was becoming quite apparent of what was happening with certain groups of people. That's just permanent arrivals of New Zealand citizens and New Zealand born persons. And you can see that this is this big spike, and it almost increased, obviously, before that cut-off of 2001. Then it dropped off, but it's obviously, this is another spike and a latter one as well. But they mirror each other in terms of New Zealand born and New Zealand citizens being very much similar in terms of the numbers. This is migration program stream and non-program migration. My non-program migration is my dotted broken line. So this is my New Zealand citizens. So as you can see, they bump along here. They peaked here around that 2001 mark. And it was announced earlier, and that's probably why there was a bit of a leap there, people catching up to get in before that came in. And clearly how it matches with, or doesn't match, here's your skilled stream and here's your family stream. Just talk about Pacific Island countries. I don't know if you've looked at a map recently of where some of these countries are. Here's Australia, here's New Zealand, and here you've got Vanuatu, Solomon Islands, Papua New Guinea, New Caledonia, Tonga, Samoa, Fiji Islands, Kiribati, etc. So are very spread out, Marshall Islands, but they all make up Pacific Islands. Hawaiian Islands are here, but they're not they're outside that group of islands. So these are Pacific countries we've been talking about. This movement to New Zealand. New Zealand facilitated a lot of the movement in terms of helping out Pacific Island countries, etc., agreements. And obviously it's not far to jump to Australia after that. So migration and development basically is most relevant in the Pacific. All those small island countries has the highest per capita level of international mobility amongst its resident populations, and its regional economy is most dependent on remittances. So very small production countries, small population, small production, so really relying on remittances being sent back to support households and the countries themselves in terms of investment. It will experience the most rapid growth of population aged 15 to 34 years over the next 2 decades, and they have limited capacity to absorb them in a workforce of any of those national economies. So this is the youth bulge, if you like, happening in these countries that just fuels migration out of the country in particular to other places, the labour mobility where they can actually get work. There's a focus of global debate on climate change-induced migration because of the vulnerability of a lot of those islands are just low atoll islands like Kiribati, Marshall Islands, etc. And due to rising sea levels and salinity intrusion, sea erosion, etc., their very fragile economies are even getting worse and are likely to get worse. And the small populations of the most Pacific nations mean that migration has the potential to have even a greater impact on them in terms of their demography, economy, and their overall social structure. So they're very vulnerable in terms of they're small, they have little production, and they're really reliant on New Zealand and Australia to an extent, but New Zealand was the country that's been more favourable to Pacific Islanders in terms of their migration there. Existing migration relationship of the Pacific Islands to Australia, any permanent movement has been extremely small. So relatively small compared to New Zealand and compared to other countries. Well, there's not much to other countries. An overwhelming dominance of temporary migration. Most of it is temporary rather than permanent. There's a lot of circulation going on, and that's because of the nature of some of the contract work that is available for seasonal workers between the islands and Australia. In particular, we haven't really encouraged permanent migration of some of these groups. Little evidence of increase over the last 2 decades, even though that 10, 20 years ago was a big push to support the southern or the Pacific Island countries. Well, it was rhetoric in some of the policy, but didn't really happen. Small levels of net migration grain in Australia is not really dramatic, and very small permanent communities within Australia. And that's not completely true now. There's quite big groups of Tongans and Fijians, etc. They'll mainly be located in Queensland than elsewhere, as we saw those figures. Queensland as a destination was being more popular, say, than South Australia. In existing system as it stands, with a strong focus on skill in our Australian migration program, that happens in both temporary and permanent programs. Skill will get all your points in your benefits rather than being unskilled or semi-skilled. Limited avenues through family migration. If you don't have permanent citizenship, resident citizenship, and you can't sponsor other family members to come, whether they're being employed or otherwise. Generally, the Pacific Seasonal Worker Program, which operates right through the islands to New Zealand and Australia, has limited opportunities and have to travel long distances, which makes it expensive for some groups that can't afford it. And generally, unlike New Zealand, Australia, seasonal worker programs for unskilled, semi-skilled workers have been limited with quite high restrictions. And I think I've told you about my PhD student from Tonga who's working on seasonal workers in Australia and is seeing that they're not necessarily winning in that situation. And that's Australian rules being quite restrictive of where they can work, how they can work, and then being exposed to the conditions like taxation and health benefits, etc. This is 1947 to 2011, my last census. This is the Pacific-born population. So they're in Australia. Remember, they're a stock of migrants in Australia. And clearly they've been increasing. The blue is Fiji. So that's been increasing most rapidly. It's one of the bigger populations. Papua New Guinea is relatively high. Samoa, again, pale bluey colours. Tonga, the rest are contributing relatively little, but generally that population has been growing, and this is Pacific-born populations. So it might not be coming directly into Australia. As I said, a lot of those people have come through the back door in terms of become New Zealand citizens, and then they've come into Australia. Pacific Island population of New Zealand, 1996, these are census figures again, 202,231. In 2011 it was estimated around 300,000, which is more than Australia overall. That was about, in total, 130,000. So this is what I said to you before. There's two categories of New Zealanders. Those who qualify for permanent residency meet the criteria that other economic migrants have to meet. And what are they? Generally. Sorry? Yeah, skilled, economic, and remember your points assessment test, you have to have certain education levels, have to fit into occupation needed in Australia category. Obviously speak English well, you have to relatively be young. They can meet the youth component, but generally not some of the other parts of that component. So they have to meet the same criteria for permanent residency. Temporary residents, even if they're trying to get a temporary visa, it's still quite difficult to jump from a temporary visa onto a permanent visa. Those who can't meet the criteria and are indefinite temporary residents. So, okay, so these are my New Zealand citizens that have come into Australia. They're there in Australia and they have to make the jump to permanent residency to collect the social security benefits and do anything else, but they could stay in that category if they don't, and they therefore become this other category of temporary residents until such time they do qualify somehow or meet some skilled or family test or something to actually stay, to get the permanent residency. And this makes it difficult for some families. They can be very large families, they're not getting unemployment benefits and not getting any child support as well. So there's fear that there becomes two level or two classes of New Zealand citizens. Remember, they're all citizens, but they make those citizens become permanent residents to get the rest of the benefits or be able to sponsor other family members to come. So, you know, like all systems, there's a catch to it in terms of what actually happens. This is just the age sex profile of New Zealand born and the total Australian born population. And my pale pink is my New Zealand born. So very young generally, groups again similar to what happens all other groups, very small proportion of older groups and very low, obviously. These are children mostly of the migrants. So this is New Zealand born, not necessarily New Zealand citizens, but the New Zealand born population. New Zealand born population, you've got some older persons here, and retirement migration is quite popular to Gold Coast and other places for New Zealanders. At that time of their life they come and buy apartments. Not sure how much circulation goes on for its permanent residents.
But
Yeah.
those elder ones can't get permanent residence.
Sorry?
The older people from New Zealand, the New Zealand born, like if you're 85, you can't get permanent residence?
You probably can't, but you probably don't need child benefits and you probably don't need unemployment benefits at that stage. And they're probably drawing a New Zealand pension.
So healthcare and things like that?
Healthcare they still have access to.
Okay.
So it's mainly some of those social security welfare benefits that got restricted in that agreement. So there is still retirement migration and others, and they might either even seek permanent residency before they retire anyway, so they probably, as long as they've got sufficient money often, they can come and settle in Australia. New Zealand is in the labour market in Australia, generally being successful. They have a high labour force participation rate at 78%, compared to about 68% for Australian born. And people born in New Zealand had an unemployment rate of roughly 4.8% compared to 4.9% for people born in Australia. So generally very similar rates of unemployment anyway. But remember, this population is younger than the Australian population, so they are more likely to be in the labour force because they're more likely working age populations. Of those who indicate that they had an occupation is again 60% skilled, 19% semi-skilled and around 20% unskilled. But they all sort of, if they're trying for permanent residence, they can go, remember they can do a points assessment test, or they might go to regional areas where sometimes more farm workers and things are available. There's all sorts of ways they still could get permanent residency when they actually come to Australia. But a lot of those New Zealanders are quite skilled in quite skilled occupations. Substantial element in trans-Tasman inflow of settlers into Australia is non-New Zealand born, former settlers of New Zealand. I know that's a handful, but yeah, they're not born in New Zealand, but they've been settlers in New Zealand. So many are from Pacific Islands and they first settled in New Zealand. One of my students been working on South African in Australia, have found a lot of them have come via New Zealand as well, which was an interesting finding that we weren't expecting, that there wasn't direct entry into Australia. They've gone to New Zealand and done a similar thing, come to Australia and then they've got permanent residence. It's called relay migration, quite common. Australian government desired to limit the influx of people who would not meet new standards of favouring skilled migration in that migration program, which was becoming really strong after 2000. So they could see what was happening and they tried to bring that program, let's say, and it probably did cut down some of the general movement. As you picked up, if they're not getting all the benefits, they're not going to come. If they've got no hope of shifting to permanent residence, they're likely to go home. So that indefinite temporary category is become a bit problematic. So a country of birth of New Zealanders arriving in Australia permanently, this is the only year I had this for, and long term, we can see the bulk of them, 3/4 were New Zealand born, UK born 3.2%, Samoan 2.3%, South African 1.9%, China 1.9%, Australia 1.1%, India 1.3%, Hong Kong, Fiji, Cook Islands, other. Remember, the Pacific Islands are really small populations, so they're really part of that other category. So yes, it seems to be a stepping migration, just not for the Pacific Islanders, but other groups as well, which we found. Hong Kong, particularly before 1997, when China was going to take over Hong Kong, New Zealand and Australia had a lot of people moving families there at that time, not knowing what the outcome was going to be. Then after that outcome, we got a surge of the Hong Kong people that became New Zealand citizens into Australia as well, so after that time. So in conclusion, Australia and New Zealand in many ways constitute a single labour market, and both may benefit through cooperation rather than competition for skilled migrants and encourage circulation. And there is quite a lot of circulation between the Australian and New Zealand labour markets. International migration, both permanent and temporary, could be part of trans-Tasman exchanges and also attract skilled workers from elsewhere. And one of, I think, the big problems is this need for lower skilled workers, semi-skilled Pacific Islanders and others to have opportunities in both countries. I think they should free it up a bit more for those groups, because basically what they've done is tighten it and they put them in this temporary category now that often then pushes them back somewhere else, even to their home countries in the Pacific. Okay, yeah?
Do we know why they want to go from New Zealand to Australia? So why, like...
Why?
Do we know why they're not happy in New Zealand?
Do you think
Australia
someone answered that? Australian economy is stronger than New Zealand economy, and they can see a lot more opportunities in Australia than New Zealand. The value of New Zealand dollar does go up and down, and that's where I said sometimes economy is good at home, they'll stay there, we won't get as many, but generally Australian economy is stronger, more work opportunities, it's perceived to be better outcomes in Australia. New Zealand, let's say, is really looking for migrants too. It's competition. They want to keep as many migrants as they can, or attract them. That's why they've, let's say, lessened some of the rules of economic migrants, and you can get into New Zealand. That's why it becomes a stepping stone into Australia. Because you know where you want to go. Maybe they come to Australia, and maybe they perceive US economy. They want to really go to America, so they get Australian citizenship, and then maybe they can trade, for somewhere else, or England or Europe or wherever. So, yeah, it's a bit of a trading game going on there. Right, just the main thing to remember, it does form